All right, so I just hit record. Hey, everybody, welcome to another interview. Today we have Dan Stormont. Um, he is the GDG lead for Tucson, as well as a whole bunch of other things. I think it's best to let him introduce himself. Dan?
All right. Thanks, Yadi. I really appreciate it. And it's great to be here with you today. I am Dan Stormont. For my day job, I am the Arizona Regional Manager for the Microsoft Philanthropies TEALS program. That's a lot to say. Essentially, the TEALS program, if you're not familiar with it, connects industry professionals and university students with high school teachers to teach computer science in high schools. So that's my job is I connect those industry professionals with teachers in schools to help make computer science happen. And of course, today and any opinions I'm offering are not official opinions of Microsoft or Microsoft Philanthropies or the TEALS program. I'm just sharing my own personal experiences and thoughts with you. But that is what I do for my day job. And then also, as when I'm away from work, as Adi said, I am the GDG Tucson organizer. I have been since 2013 when I started GDG Tucson up here. I'm also currently the one of the Mountain Region mentors for the Google developer groups. So I just started doing that last month. So I'm really excited to do that. I'm looking forward to it. I probably should have done it before now. It's one of those things that I've been around for a while and, I've known a lot of the other mentors and I kept thinking, I really should be a mentor myself. So that's what I'm doing as well. And really appreciate the opportunity to work with the Developer Students Club at University of Arizona. I think that that's really great to see that happen at U of A, and I'm so happy to see that, Adi. I'm glad to see you've been making that happen. So that's great that it's an active organization. In addition to GDG Tucson, I also am the brigade captain for Code for Tucson, which is the local brigade of Code for America. Code for America, of course, is the national or actually even international organization of civic hackers that help to make government more responsive to people. And then, as if that wasn't enough, I also am the champion for Coder Dojo Tucson, which is coding clubs for kids 8 to 18, just to get them excited about things like microbits and fun stuff to play with like that. So that's what I do.
That that is a lot. And so, how do you sort of uh, get to this point? Could you talk a little bit about your journey, what it looked like, where you started, how you ended up here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So mine is maybe not um, quite as traditional as other people's, but I mean, I found over the time talking with people about how they got to where they're at in the tech industry that really there are a lot of different paths. I mean, in fact, I just was talking to someone right before I joined you that he got into avionics through just like various experiences, kind of starting out the same way I did. He doesn't even have a university degree, and yet he's been working there so long, has a lot of experience that he gets jobs in avionics because he just has a lot of experience. I have a cousin that's the same way. School was not for him. He dropped out and he ended up being a network admin in the Bay Area. But that doesn't work for everyone. Usually most people end up going through college education to get their jobs, and we will definitely talk about that. I did start out as an avionics maintainer, so I didn't start off with a degree. I was working on avionics. And if you don't know, avionics is aircraft electronics. So they're electronic systems that go onto aircraft. There are a lot of different considerations there that you have to deal with, vibration, noise, electromagnetic pulse. There's all kinds of things that you have to deal with avionics that you don't deal with a cell phone, for example. And I worked in maintenance on those electronic warfare systems on F4s in Germany, F-16s in Nevada, and I was on the initial maintenance cadre for the B-1 in Texas, which there's a picture of one behind me there. So I did all that, went back to the University of Arizona. I'd been taking night classes all during this time, finished up a degree in computer engineering at U of A, went to the program office where I again worked on the B1. And so now I was designing the upgrade to the computer systems for the B1 and working with a lot of contractors to do that. Worked in modeling and sim, and also taught at the university level for a number of years. Got a master's in electrical engineering, focusing on artificial intelligence and robotics. And that was something I was really, and still am passionate about. I really still love working with robotics. And then also finished up the electrical engineer degree, again, working in artificial intelligence and robotics, focusing on swarms of robots used in urban search and rescue. So a lot of interesting stuff there from the academic side. Unfortunately, when I finished up my degree, that was like the real bad spot with robotics. There are a few really big ticket things like the Google self-driving car and some autonomous robotics or autonomous mining equipment, but really wasn't an opportunity for me to find a job. The job market wasn't very good. So I ended up continuing on doing things like working support for Juniper Networks for their large scale WAN and LAN accelerators. And I also was working for a startup that would made what eventually became the Microsoft Surface Hub. So if you're familiar with that, that's a big, 82. I think now it's 85 inches. They made a little bit bigger glass, but multiple touch points, and it's really no limit to how many touch points you can have on it. So it's just a giant touch screen that's usually used in a conference room setting. And I was doing the customization of those. So I would go out to the customer site, work with them to figure out what they needed, do the skinning, do any custom apps or any modification to our existing apps for it. And so that's what I was doing before coming here to Tucson. I was working on a startup of my own for a little while, trying to help subsistence farmers in remote parts of the world to be able to figure out what they should plant when, because surprisingly, that is actually an issue. There's a lot of lack of knowledge. A lot of times you'll get this local knowledge that just says, well, keep planning the same thing over and over, and it may not always be the right thing either from the market standpoint or from the weather conditions standpoint. So, we're going to build this app that was going to just mash together some NASA data and some NOAA data and some crop growing data, and we'll just put it all together. And, a farmer anywhere in the world can get on their cell phone and can be able to look this up. Turns out that's not as easy as we thought it was going to be. There's not really a good database of crop data, for example, what to grow where. And also, I discovered working with various groups in other countries. Like, for example, I was working with some developers in the Dominican Republic, and I didn't realize that for their cell phone use, they don't, at least at the time, they don't have unlimited data, but they had unlimited text. So you had to kind of pivot everything to work with SMS instead of a cell phone app. So, learned a lot through that process. I also, after I decided, this is going to be much harder to get going than I have the time or patience to wait for, I ended up at the Pima County Library working with youth there and also adults in business and tech education. Worked with Watershed Management Group for a little while here in Tucson as the Green Co-op manager, because I also enjoy doing things on sustainability and water harvesting. That's something I'm very passionate about. And then for just about the last 3 years now, I've been with Microsoft Philanthropies. So long story, but yeah, that's my whole backstory there.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like you've been around the block a couple of times. I think so. A lot of people, I'm sure, uh, like you said, will agree that your journey has not been the most traditional one. Um, so, but I do want to ask you about people who are taking more traditional journeys, but are sort of a little bit more niche in terms of in terms of the recruiting process. So,
Mhm.
because we come from a non-target school, right? Um, and so, since you've been at all these different places, I was wondering if you had any insight about when companies are recruiting interns, what are they looking for? Are they looking for technologies that that students showcased that they use as well? Are they just looking to see that students are building things? What's that sort of thought process like?
Yeah, it can vary. And I would say with any of the tech companies, and I have interviewed with a lot of them, obviously, I've done the on campus interview for Google. Unfortunately, I didn't get that one. I didn't do as well in the algorithms questions as I should have. I should have studied more. And that's not an unusual process, actually. I mean, a lot of people will go to the the interview process at Google, and I've heard that typically it can take 2 or 3 tries before you'll finally get hired. But for interns, that really kind of depends because a lot of it depends on the team that's doing the hiring. So it's not so much the company. We tend to think of Microsoft or Facebook or Google or Amazon or whatever as being this monolith. But a lot of times when it comes down to who they choose for an intern, the decision is made internally in the team where they're going to be hiring that intern. And so, most times when, for example, just my experience with Microsoft and some of the summer interns that we've hired for the TEALS program, a lot of times it wasn't necessarily whether they were at a target school. So, yeah, I mean, we always talk about the MITs and the Caltechs and Stanford and all of these schools that kind of have that in with the tech companies. But a lot of times they're really looking for um, a little bit of background for one thing. They want to kind of know who you are and where you came from, and they also want to see that you've got the drive to commit and that you're going to fit into the team well. So, I mean, that has a lot to do with it. That's actually, again, going back to that Google interview, that's a lot of what they're looking for. And I don't know if you want to talk about that now or talk about that later, but that's an interesting process of how that on-campus interview happens, and I'd be happy to talk about that. But
Oh
they're
yeah,
really
let's talk
looking.
about that now. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So when I went to Google is a kind of a two-step process. So the first thing, well, really it's 3 steps because the first thing is you get contacted by one of the recruiters for Google. And a lot of times that'll happen through someone internally at Google recommending your name. And so, that's where that networking plays in, where you really want to get involved and just, go to meetups, meet people, find people who are working in an area you're interested in, and get to know them and let them know you, because that helps a lot. A lot of times that first initial contact comes because someone in the company said, hey, I know this person and I think we ought to interview them. And so then the recruiter will reach out and say, I looked at your resume on LinkedIn or whatever, and you look like you might be a good fit for some of the teams that we're hiring for, and so we'd like you to do an initial interview. And so they'll set that up. The initial interview is usually over either over the phone, or more likely now it's going to be live stream like this. You're going to be just in meeting with, for example, with Google, you'll be doing a Google Meet, and you'll share a workspace, and you'll get asked a couple of questions, and you'll usually just put your answers in there. So you may be asked a question, just a simple thing about an algorithm. How would you address this problem? And you could write it out. It doesn't even have to be working code. You're just going to write out how you would approach that problem and talk through the process. So it's kind of what you've heard a lot about tech interviews. And if that goes well, then they'll say, okay, we want to bring you in for the in-person interview next. And so, at least in the past, right now I know it's been different this year, but in the past, they'd fly you out to the campus in Mountain View, and you would be there for the full day. So it's really, they say it's 5 interviews, it's really 6. So what happens is you come in the morning and you have these 45-minute interview sessions, and one of the engineers from Google will come in. You'll be in a small little conference room with a whiteboard, and they'll just ask you a question like, if you, and I'm not going to give the actual questions because I can't really do that, but it'll be something about, if given that this search algorithm has this efficiency, if we gave you a different data set, how would you redesign that, and what would the efficiency be of that? So you really need to know a lot about, big O and what that means, what the efficiency of your algorithms are. Also, something that's really critical when you're doing that is you need to think, what if it's easy to design on the fly, and you're doing this on the fly, so it's hard to really think about it in that 45 minutes. So you have to get your thoughts together really quickly and write out what the what approach you would take to something. But then a lot of times the next question after that is going to be, well, what if we changed the input to look like this? And so you need to think flexibly enough. You need to be thinking ahead that, all right, if I, for example, had a problem where I need to draw a horizontal line, and I just write this naive algorithm that takes the two endpoints and then just draws a line between them, what's going to happen when they give you a diagonal line or a vertical line? So you need to make sure that it's going to be robust enough to be able to handle those different input cases or different applications. And so they do those kind of questions. So you usually have like three algorithm based questions. They're different parts of algorithms, but it's a lot of what you've learned in algorithms class as a computer scientist. So that's something you're going to see a lot. And then you'll normally go to a lunch break after that. And the lunch break is with another Googler. And don't think it's just lunch, because it's actually also an interview. That that lunch is where they're just trying to get to know you, and they're trying to gauge how well you would fit in with the culture. And so that's a lot of it's not a high pressure thing. It's very comfortable and all that, but at the same time, that person is evaluating you while you're having lunch. And then after that, there's normally two more interviews, and those are focused more on the team that you're interviewing for. So they'll usually have an engineer from that team come in and ask you some questions related to what they specifically do. And so you may answer questions about anything from how to create a test framework to how to do an artificial intelligence algorithm, or whatever it may be. That's what they're trying to gauge at that point, is what is your knowledge level for the job that you're applying for. So that's the whole process. Unfortunately, yeah, like I said, I think they don't tell you what your score is. They score you all, and basically it's a go, no go. And so you'll usually get an offer depending on the needs. If you get a 3 out of 5, if you get a 5 out of 5, you're almost certainly going to get one, unless they decided that culturally you weren't going to be a fit. So you could still score perfectly, and they decide, this person is going to be such a pain to work with that I don't want to work with them. So that
Right.
can also that can also rule you out. But yeah, like I said, I kind of choked. I hadn't reviewed a lot of my algorithms for years, and there are questions that I just on the fly I was not ready for, and that was really on me. So yeah, they don't tell you what your score is, but I would, just guesstimating, I think it was probably a 3 out of 5, which at that time they didn't have enough need that they would give me an offer.
Right. I definitely see what you mean, and I think um, I think there are a lot of resources, and this is obviously very valuable, right? Where you sort of talk about the interview process, what they expect. But I think where a lot of people get stuck is the first step of making contact.
Yeah.
Um, and so I want to talk about that a little bit. You mentioned that you need to go out there, you need to network, you need to, and then they might uh, give you a referral internally, and a recruiter contacts you. Um, what's the process for getting a referral? Where do you, how do you reach out to people, and how do you sort of build up to that question where you say, "Can I get a referral?" Or do you even ask that explicitly at all?
Um, I wouldn't really explicitly ask that, because I mean, although a lot of times people won't mind that, I have had people ask me for referrals, and a lot of times you'll find that with professionals, when you ask them, they can't necessarily give a referral that way. So, if you're asking for a letter or something like that, a lot of times, like, I'm not allowed to give referrals to any of the volunteers that work for me in the TEALS program. So I can't actually even offer that. I can't give them a referral letter. But what I meant as far as a referral is, usually it's more of an internal thing. So um, what I was meaning, and it's a little harder. I mean, for example, this is much more apparent in the Bay Area when I was there, because you'll go to meetups and you'll talk to people, and usually what'll happen is, in the conversation, something will come up about what they do and what their current needs are, if they need to hire someone. And so you sort of get this idea of, oh yeah, hey, I think that I would be a good fit for that, and I wouldn't mind hearing more about this. And so it's a conversation. You know, we kind of think about, and I see this actually with college students a lot, and I understand this. You know, you're sending out a bunch of resumes to all these different job openings that you're finding on various job boards and all that. And honestly, that rarely works. There are a few places it does work. If you're getting a government job, for example, you've got to go apply at USA jobs, and you have to submit that application before anybody will even talk to you. Then you have to try and find a place to interview, and that one's a much more traditional kind of job board driven process. But for most companies, it's really not. At some point you have to submit an application just to get in their system, but it doesn't usually start that way. It usually starts by just having these relationships, and that's where it's good for things like the DSC, that if you're making connections with people in tech, it gives you an opportunity to be able to find out what they're doing, find out what their company does, and find out what their needs are. And a lot of times it's just that communication. You've met with them for a while. It's not usually the first time you talk to them, but maybe the third or fourth time you see them at a meetup, they'll say, "Oh yeah, we're hiring for this new project that we're starting." And that's the point that you can go, "Wow, that sounds really interesting. Can you put me in touch with someone that I can talk to about that?" And that's how I've gotten almost all of my interviews. It's all been through word of mouth from somebody else who knew something, was in the company, knew something about that project, and was able to get me an interview. Another thing, for example, when I was in the Bay Area, I was in a hackathon. Was actually a game jam. Essentially, they called it a hackathon, but it was essentially what we would call a game jam, where you were coding up a game in most of a day. So it was like a Saturday event, and they had this kind of, it was actually something called Escape from Dev Null. So it was a lot of different game challenges that you had to address. And I just, for fun, I went and did that, and um, worked with, they placed you, because I didn't have my own team coming in, they placed me with someone else, and we just made this ad hoc team and worked on the challenges. We didn't do all that well, but afterwards, one of the EA managers came up and said, "We'd really like to interview you, because we just threw you together as this team, and you worked really well together." And so I did an interview. They made an offer. I kind of decided at that time, especially, EA had a reputation for being kind of like, you know, a, a sweat house. It's kind of like, it was a place that was really very challenging place to work. And I just really didn't feel that I wanted to do that at the time. So I didn't pursue it. But I've heard the EA's gotten better, by the way. So I will clarify that. Um, but that's the kind of thing that happens. So it can be getting involved in hackathons, getting involved in meetups, talking to people, asking them those questions. The UA Game Dev Club, if any of you are involved with that, they have a lot of interviews where they bring in industry professionals in the games industry, and they will, just talk about the things they're looking for and the things they need. And that's a good chance to ask your questions. And a lot of times they'll give their contact info. So, I mean, don't feel bad about asking them a little more about, I was really fascinated about this, and I would love to do X, Y, or Z in the industry. So, how can I get started on that? Most of the time, people are happy to give you some advice about how to get into the field, and whatever that is, whether it's you want to be in avionics, or you want to be mobile development, web development, game development, whatever you're interested in. you know People in those fields are more than happy usually to share their thoughts about how to get started, and advice about how to do that. And then just having that connection usually can pay off. So it's frustrating, I know, because you're thinking you want to have those job interviews lined up before you graduate, and a lot of times it doesn't necessarily happen that way. It's kind of, you know things will come up in the cycle of the business, and that's when, if you have that relationship, somebody you've talked to will think, "Oh yeah, I remember I talked to Addie, and he had this interest in doing, what we're working on in this project. So I'm going to reach out and see if you'd be interested in interviewing for a job. That's kind of how those things happen.
Definitely. Yeah, so connections are definitely important, and I think you also mentioned a couple of resources that we have here at the university. So we do have Hack Arizona. We have the Game Dev Club, which I think should be linked on our Discord, but it is linked in the unofficial CS Discord. So you guys should go and join that. Um, I think we bring in a lot of speakers as well through Google, and then you should go attend those events as well. I think that's another great
Yep.
resource. Um, but I want to pivot a little bit, and I want to ask, do we have anything else in Tucson that you're sort of familiar with that, serve as good opportunities for networking? So we have the
Yeah.
hackathon, which is in person, but
Mhm.
other than the clubs, do we have like, conferences, any other tech meetups? Because there's obviously a difference in the sort of tech hub that Tucson is versus the Bay
Right.
Area.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, uh, being totally honest, I mean, it's a much harder thing to find work in Tucson than it is in the Bay Area or even in Phoenix for that matter. So, yeah, that is definitely a challenge. And a lot of it depends what you're looking for. So, if you're thinking that, I don't necessarily want to go work for one of the big tech companies, but I'd like to, maybe do some work with a startup and see where that would go. Startup Tucson is definitely a good organization to get to know. They do things like startup weekends. They also help to, along with others, help to organize things like the 10 West Festival, which is another thing that unfortunately didn't happen last year, should happen again this year. And that's kind of Tucson's version of South by Southwest. So it brings a lot of things together. It brings business together, education, entertainment, but there's also a tech and startup component to it. So that can be something that's really good to know. And again, especially if you have an idea. And I would say for Tucson, especially, if you have this idea of something that you think would be a great project that could be spun into a business, um, we're actually really good at that in Tucson. We don't have the big tech companies. We have a few defense contractors like Raytheon. We've got IBM, but we don't have a lot of the really big tech companies here. But we do have a very vibrant startup culture. So that is something to think about. It also, of course, it has the downside of there's a lot of risk there. It usually takes a little time to get a startup going, until you can get at least some venture capital. It's hard to pay yourself. And so that is one of the concerns that you have with going into startup. And I understand why a lot of people shy away from that. They're looking for an actual paying job, with either one of the smaller optics companies or something like that, or with Raytheon. And I totally get that. But that is something that I think is a real opportunity, is to get involved with Startup Tucson. Of course, there's also the University of Arizona Women's Hackathon as well as Hack AZ. So those are both good hackathons. And even though it says Women's Hackathon, it's not specifically just for women. It's for you know females, female identifying, and allies. So, really pretty much anyone is welcome at the University of Arizona Women's Hackathon. Hopefully, that'll be in person again in October. So, again, a lot of these things have been virtual and haven't been working quite as well. In fact, the Women's Hackathon, we've been doing a virtual one. I still have a robotics competition that's going on through the end of next month, but it's been really hard doing this virtually compared to how we've done them in the past in person. So that's a good thing to be aware of. Um, Trying to think, there are a number of meetup groups, maybe not quite as many, of course, besides the obvious ones, the ones I mentioned, Code for Tucson, GDG Tucson, GDG Cloud Tucson. Andrew Slattery runs that. So if you're really interested in cloud, he's been the one running that. And Andrew's a great guy. I've known him for years, and he used to be one of the co-organizers with GDG Tucson till he spun off Google GDG Cloud Tucson. So that's another one to get involved in. Um, Trying to think. Well, there are also things like, if you have a specific language interest, the Tucson Python meetup group is pretty active, and they do some interesting stuff, and always looking for both people to participate, improve their Python skills, and also people, if you have something you'd like to present, they're very open to doing presentations. I did one last month on, how to do Python with a Raspberry Pi Zero. So I got Pi zeros out to everybody, had them set it up headlessly, and then do some Python programming on it. So, just to get them familiar with that single board computing with Raspberry Pi. So, there are a number of things like that. There used to be a React group here that is not as active. So there've been a few JavaScript oriented meetup groups that have been kind of on and off again. So again, definitely check it out. Look at Meetup and see what's on there. But a few of the ones that were active in the past, like the .NET group and the Java group and even the JavaScript group, have kind of fallen off in the numbers of meetings. I think they still have some occasionally, but they're not as active as they used to be.
Yep. So I'm hearing a lot of great resources, and I think maybe after this we could even compile them
Sure.
into either a document or like a Discord announcement and send them out with like links so people can actually access these and uh, you know go look at those opportunities. But besides that, I'm actually done with my list of questions. So I think the last thing I want to ask is, do you have any other advice that you want to give students looking to get into the tech industry? And if so, what is it?
I would say that being a student, of course, is difficult because, I mean, first of all, you're just trying to focus on what you need to do to get done with school, and I get that. I've been there, so that's your main focus. But don't forget to focus on those other things that can actually be a good selling point. Like I mentioned, the networking. It's hard when you've got homework and projects and exams to study for and all the rest of that. It's really hard to take the time to get involved with meetup groups or get involved with the community. But those are the kind of things that will really help you down the road. So make sure you take the time to do that. And then also just, don't necessarily think just in terms of all the traditional avenues. It's kind of easy to think, well, if I'm a computer scientist, I've got to go interview with Amazon and Microsoft and Facebook and Google, and they're the ones I've got to look at, because there are a lot of opportunities that are not necessarily as obvious. For example, and I just learned this a couple of years ago myself. I was really surprised. USAA, which is the bank that serves military families, they have an Internet of Things office up in Phoenix. I had no idea they were even into Internet of Things development. So, there are a lot of times that there are companies that are doing things that might be of interest to you that you wouldn't traditionally think of. Same thing like insurance companies a lot of times will do things like app development, or there are some medical diagnostic companies that do a lot of work with embedded systems. So there's just a lot of different opportunities. Don't think just in terms of the big ones you normally think of, but think of smaller things. And then of course, if you're somebody who's willing to take a little risk, definitely think if about, is there a problem that I see in my life that I can solve through applying technology, and could I spin that into a business that would be self-sustaining? That's something it's always best, if you can, to work for yourself than to work for someone else, but also recognize that startups, especially in the initial phases, are pretty draining. So it does take a lot. You're pouring your heart and soul into it. So you've got to ask yourself if that's something that you really want to do as well. Are the 60-hour weeks or more until you can get it to pay off really what you want to do, or would you like to have something that's maybe got a little better work-life balance? And finally, of course, I just mentioned the work-life balance. Make sure you're taking the time for yourself too. It's so easy in this field at any point to get so focused on all the things that you need to do that you're not taking care of yourself. You're not taking enough time to have some downtime. You're not getting out and exercising. You're not getting out and just being a part of the community. And that's something that is really true, of course, with university students as well, is you tend to be in the bubble. It's like there's the boundaries of campus and some housing around it, and a lot of students maybe downtown, maybe Fourth Avenue, but you know a lot of students don't really venture outside of that. And so take the time to get out and learn a little bit about the community you're in too. And that's another way to make those connections and to discover some possibilities you maybe didn't even think about. There may be some community organization that you recognize really needs some help with something. They need help with something as simple as a website, or they maybe need something with, there's a process they're doing that could really be improved if you applied some low cost tech to it. And so, take a look at those and think about those things that you can expand yourself by getting in connection with them. It makes you a more rounded person. And a lot of tech companies are looking for that too. Even when you're looking at the big ones, they want to see that you're not just an engineer, but you're also an engineer that does other things, that has other interests and that has community involvement. So I know that's a lot, but it really does, the more rounded an individual is, the more background you have, the more appealing you are when you do try to go look for that job.
Yeah, that's that's a lot of great advice. I think all of it's definitely valuable, especially everything you said about going out and making connections through meetups, just going out into the community, reaching out to people at hackathons, just starting up that conversation. Um, I think the only thing left to do is to actually send out that list of resources to the club. Um, hopefully, hopefully sometime soon. Um, uh, but otherwise, thank you for being on here. This was great. I think everybody learned a lot. Um, and I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording. Thank you for being
All
here.
right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Addie, for having me. It's been great.